Welcome to All Grown Up Now, Tales of a Checkered Past. I'm Kenneth D. King, podcasting from my studio near Union Square in New York City. This podcast is an evolution of the tale, All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts. This is Season 2, and it's called Tales of a Checkered Past. It's a collection of short stories from my salad days on up to the present. In each podcast, another self-contained story will be presented. These podcasts will be broadcast bi-weekly, so you get 2 a month. Enjoy. Episode 45 is called Love Letter to Susan. This is recorded in December of 2018, and while it is the holiday season, I think of those people who I lose, and I lose people generally between Thanksgiving and January 6th. One such person is my dear friend, Susan Weiss. So this is my love letter to Susan. Susan Weiss. I met Susan in 1981 during my first year in San Francisco. She was Miss Ann's age, and when she met Miss Ann, she was fascinated. "Darling angel," and she always called me that. "She looks like a princess," Susan exclaimed. I had started ushering at the Opera House in San Francisco, and I met her there through the bishop. She hung out there with the bishop, who was the one who got me the ushering gig. The 3 of us would meet during intermission, dishing the performance and people watching. Susan would also accompany us on adventures, like the Cambodian wedding in the Tenderloin, where the Crown Prince of Cambodia married his betrothed, and the bishop officiated. Susan was married to George Weiss, who, among other occupations, was the head usher in the orchestra. Their romance didn't start at the Opera House. They met at a party years before in the Oakland Hills. Now, Susan and George were an interesting and I always felt glamorous couple. Susan was born in London to an upper-crust family. She survived the Blitz and was sent to a Catholic school for girls, even though she was Jewish, in the countryside until she was expelled for bad behavior. It seems that she wouldn't wear her gas mask, though she was constantly being nagged to wear it during air raids. So, during one air raid, she did wear it. Just the mask, nothing else, and was promptly expelled. This was the beginning of a trend. Susan did as she pleased and didn't give a damn about what other people thought of it. Susan left high school to make her way as a columnist on Fleet Street, where she reported on the doings of all the bright young things in London after the war. To supplement her income, she was an artist's model. "Undraped, darling angel, of course," she told me one day, when she wasn't staying at her parents' apartment in Paris or getting engaged. "Darling angel, I got engaged a lot. It was the thing to do," she explained with a mischievous glint in her eye. "One can do a lot if one were engaged. Not that I misbehaved. Good heavens, no." Then she laughed. Her husband George is a real gent, born in Oakland on the wrong side of the tracks, who, with his brothers, opened a jazz club in the Tenderloin called the Blackhawk, which is mentioned in all the jazz history books. They hosted all the greats. Billie Holiday's last gig was at the Blackhawk. Susan told me once that at Billie's last gig at the Blackhawk, she knew, when buttoning Billie's dress and aiming her at the stage, that the end was near. Billie was too far gone. The Blackhawk existed in the early 50s, along with other now legendary night spots in San Francisco. There was the Hungry Eye, where Phyllis Diller got her start doing comedy. Then there was the Condor, which Carol Doda made famous in the early 60s by wearing Rudy Gehrich's topless bathing suit and broke that particular taboo. The Blackhawk was one of those famous places, the go-to place for jazz, and anyone who was anyone went. There are classic recordings of jazz greats done at the Blackhawk, It was a big damn deal. Apparently, Johnny Mathis got fired from the Blackhawk. As Susan said, he doesn't discuss that period of his career. Since it was housed in one of her previous business addresses, the famed Madam Sally Stanford was at the Blackhawk on opening night, which, by the way, featured Tempest Storm taking a milk bath while Johnny Mathis sang "Oh, Promise Me." No wonder he doesn't discuss that period. The venerable Miss Stanford, who ran a string of houses and later went respectable and became mayor of Sausalito, told George that night that all the people who claimed to be in that room when it was her establishment never were. They were just bragging, and she would know. George and his brothers were also the original founders and partners, along with Saul Zaentz, of Fantasy Records. Saul Zaentz went on to produce films and sold Fantasy Records to David Geffen, as I remember. Susan and George had a painting over their sofa that George would proudly tell people about. It was used on the cover of one of the first albums they produced for Fantasy Records. It was this association, along with the Blackhawk, that made Susan and George members in good standing with the jazz community. Along with the jazz musicians, Susan met Herb Caen, who frequented the Blackhawk during its and his glory days. Herb Caen was the inventor of three-dot journalism, as he would say. He was San Francisco's version of Walter Winchell. Herb and Susan had an ongoing acquaintance from the Blackhawk days on, and Susan was in Herb's column many, many times over the years. "Darling Angel, one isn't truly a San Franciscan until one has been in Herb Caen's column," she once declared to me, right after my one mention in Herb Caen, which, by the way, was for making the red hat for Elton John's Diet Coke commercial, the one called Nightclub, which had all sorts of dead movie stars electronically inserted into it. This caused quite a stir. So there. According to Susan, she and George met through what Susan called the Jewish Princess Network. Susan was visiting San Francisco in the early 50s and decided she wanted to stay. So, through connections on the network, she met and married George within 2 weeks, and so got her green card. "Darling Angel, I married George for my green card, but it worked out quite well," she confided to me one day at lunch. "He's really funny and kind, and we've really had fun and a good life together. What more can one ask?" Now, George's version of the story is a little different, but quite charming. He told me one evening over dinner that he was invited to a party for one of the jazz greats. I can't remember which one, but he knew them all from the Blackhawk, and this guy had a house in the Oakland Hills. The house was considered quite avant-garde for the time, this being the mid-50s. There was a very large tree growing up through the living room ceiling. Anyway, George and Susan were introduced at this party, and he was immediately smitten. "She looked like an English version of Elizabeth Taylor, so beautiful and refined," George said. "I thought that she was really a solid person, and that if I could marry her, we would be very happy." George went on to tell me about their early years. George, as well as running the Blackhawk, played cards in a card room on the peninsula. He approached the management to see if he could get a game going and develop a customer for that game. I guess that's what you'd call it. And if he developed a business, then he would get a percentage. The first day, Susan was recruited to be one of the card players, even though she didn't know how, so they would have enough people to play. At one point, one of the paying players asked her a question. Panicked, Susan excused herself and locked herself into the ladies' room. "She's changed a lot since then," George observed, smiling. And indeed she had. Aside from this momentary lapse, Susan had walked through life with her head up and her spirits high. Over the years, I saw her through some serious health problems as well as more than her share of troubles. She remained the same brave, true spirit that showed up wearing only a gas mask, posed undraped for artists in London, and found her green card husband in San Francisco. Speaking of health problems, One time, Susan and I were talking about the spinal surgery she had had some years before. The doctor had told Susan at the time that she might not walk again. "Darling angel, I insisted that this was not an option," she exclaimed. "There are roles on the Opera House stage that I've not performed yet, and this simply wouldn't do." You see, Susan did what were called supernumerary roles. These are the roles for mute actors that advance the action but don't require lines or singing. She had done some in the past, but had others she wanted to do, and no surgery was going to stand in the way. So, not only does she walk, but when a particularly demanding role comes her way, she tells her doctor that she's doing it and what action is required, and then gets him to show her ways to do it without injuring herself. Not doing a role because of her back, well, it isn't even considered. Actually, Susan's crowning achievement was Lady Capulet in Romeo and Juliet. "Darling angel, my costume looks like they got their money last week," she exclaimed. For the opera Mephistopheles, Susan got her photo into Vogue magazine with her performance of the old woman peeling apples, or, as she says, the visual metaphor in the second act. Her words. So Susan got into Vogue magazine before I did. Susan was also an avid ballet fan, and she never missed a performance if she could help it. She and George also went to see lots of theater, traditional theater, as well as the more avant-garde offerings available in San Francisco. One time I asked her about a particular theater event she had attended at one of the alternative venues in the city, and she drawled, "Darling angel, it was Shakespeare in the Nude on roller skates." That particular epigram became code forever between us, indicating a self-consciously arty performance and not arty in a good way. When I was still with my trophy husband, I would subject myself to his student concerts. Sometimes I could convince Susan to come with me. One time, Matt was singing in a concert at Old First Church on Van Ness. I wanted Susan to go with me because misery loves company, but Susan objected to going because it was a Christian house of worship, and she's Jewish. The night before, when we were ushering at the Opera House, I made my big pitch. "If you go to this, I have a gift I've made for you that I'll bring. But you have to promise that you'll wear it." "What is it, darling angel?" she said. "Well, I can't say, but you'll love it. It's a surprise, so promise." She did, suspiciously, but she did. The next evening, I showed up to the church with a waist-length black Pont d'Esprit lace veil, somewhat like Jackie Kennedy wore to the funeral. When I was riding on the bus to the concert, this very old San Francisco lady, complete with the hat, the gloves, and a handbag that looked like the fender skirts off a beige 1959 Cadillac, was sitting next to me and inquired about the veil, asking sympathetically, "Did somebody die?" "No," I said. "One of my friends is being forced to go into a Christian house of worship, and this will screen out the Christianity." "I see," the old lady said weakly and turned to look out the window. When I got to the church, Susan was there. You should have heard what she said when she saw the veil. "Darling angel, you want me to wear that?" she shrieked. "Well, you promised." "Would your mother wear this?" Susan was desperately grasping at straws. "If my mother promised me she would wear it, she would wear it," I said, pounding my chest for emphasis. Knowing she'd been had, Susan took the veil. Laughing, she decided that it could be good training for another super role at the Opera House stage. While she was adjusting it, I explained the Christianity filtering properties of the black Pont d'Esprit veiling. As we walked into the sanctuary, Susan pulled a lace hanky out of her bag. Now, I was impressed. How many people just happen to have lace hankies in their handbags? But she did. She daintily dabbed her eyes during the performance, and she behaved like a grieving widow, sighing and dabbing. It helped that she happened to be wearing black. It really grieved her to be in a Christian house of worship That was her motivation for this particular role. Later, my trophy husband told me that Susan was the talk of the evening. People remarked that it was rare to see that type of morning these days. Then there was that time that I prevailed upon Susan and George to go with me to an experimental musical performance at a dingy place on Divisadero called The Lab. Matt was going to wear body paint and sing, even though he couldn't remember lyrics nor carry a tune in a Gucci bag, and it was going to be very avant-garde and on the edge. Susan was always up for avant-garde. That's how I convinced her to go. This performance, though, turned out not to be avant-garde, but more like what she would refer to as Shakespeare in the Nude on roller skates. It was a disaster. First of all, I got separated from Susan and George, and it was bleacher seating. Then the whole performance was the theater equivalent of a root canal with no Novocaine. Having one's fingernails pulled out with pliers would have been less painful, and coincidentally, that's what it sounded like they were doing to all the singers. I didn't hear the end of it from Susan for weeks. When Matt, the trophy husband, and I split, it was Susan who had the best advice. "Darling angel, let this be a lesson. Next time, marry up. Never marry a man whose parents bought plate. Only marry a man who inherited his silver." Which I did, by the way. So there. In the early days of my business, Susan was my first angel. I needed to raise some money, $1,000, for equipment and tooling. Not a lot, but at the time it was a lot more than I had. I had mentioned it in passing, and a few days later, Susan stopped by my studio with a check and a promissory note from George for that amount. "Darling angel, I asked George to go get my diamond necklace from the vault," Susan said. "I had the fantasy that I'd go to the pawn shop, hawk it, and lend you the money and be your angel." Apparently, George asked her just what she was up to, and after she explained what she wanted, he took the money out of savings to lend me. The promissory note was paid on time with interest. The interest was just what it would accrue in the passbook savings account. George said he didn't want to gouge, and I was deeply grateful. For Hanukkah that year, I gave her one of the muffs from the series of muffs I had made. It was a green velvet one that she had particularly loved. She was delighted. A few weeks later, I got 2 messages on my answering machine. The first one was from Susan. "Darling angel, I'm sending you my muff. It is my most cherished possession. Could you make shoulder straps for it so I could carry it as a handbag? Get it back to me soon, please. It's my most cherished possession. Mwah." The next message was from George. "Hello, Ken. This is George. I was walking by the phone when I heard Susan say, 'My muff is my most cherished possession.' I thought she was either talking to the doctor or she was calling you." Over the years, Susan was the glamorous Jewish mother I always wanted. We went to all sorts of functions as she was up for any adventure. And as I said, she braved my trophy husband's excruciating student concerts. She also braved my forays into the club scene, where one time we both got caught like Velcro in Miss Cobalt's wig. And I introduced her to the wonderful world of thrift shopping. After dealing with the estate issues after Miss Ann's death, I arrived back home to find a message on my answering machine from Susan. "Darling angel, we need to go to Max's Opera Plaza to have a big fat dessert. You need it, and I have something to celebrate," she said. So, one Saturday evening, before going to the Opera House, Susan and I settled into a banquette at Max's and ordered up something big, fattening, and chocolate. Then she turned and looked at me. "So what are we celebrating?" I asked. I don't have lung cancer, darling angel. I guess Susan saw that I might have gone pale. I was certainly feeling a little wobbly, so she quickly said, I know what you've just gone through with your mother and all, and so I didn't want to say anything before, but I got the news a few days ago that this was all a false alarm. Well, thank God that it was, I exclaimed. Let's look forward to years of good health for you. We sat there for a few moments, quiet. Susan looked at me. Darling angel, if I were to have had lung cancer, you would have helped me commit suicide. My mouth went dry. You know, dying isn't something I'm really afraid of, Susan continued quietly. Because, darling angel, if I had to go tomorrow, I can truly say, wasn't it great? I've done everything I wanted to do, been to many of the places I had hoped to travel to, and even played Lady Capulet on the Opera House stage, quite well, I might add. If I went tomorrow, I wouldn't have any regrets. This hit me like a ton of bricks. Susan had a wonderful life, to be sure, which she fearlessly created. She had more than her share of troubles, health-wise and otherwise. I had seen her through some of these issues over the years, and I watched how she always ended up back on her feet with her delightful outlook intact. Susan lived through all of the bad times, but chose to embrace the good times, which she actively sought by being such an adventurous spirit. I contrasted that with Miss Anne, who was too scared to live, and then on her deathbed was too scared to die. Seeing these two examples in such rapid succession made a real impression on me. I resolved that when I go, I want to go like Susan. When I moved to New York, Susan was devastated. But she understood why I had to go, and she cheered my successes when I arrived here. We spoke frequently on the phone, and whenever I would visit San Francisco, we would meet for our traditional tea at the Rotunda at Neiman Marcus. In the fall of 2012, I called Susan. I got the machine, but that happens sometimes. I left a message and didn't think much about it. But it wasn't like her not to call back. She was generally very prompt about it. Then, near the end of January of 2013, I got a note from George. It said, Dear Ken, I sadly must inform you that Susan died on December 4th. Susan took ill with something unknown. The hospice nurses came to our house daily to ease her suffering. Forgive me, but during her illness, she asked me to contact you. I didn't, because I hoped she would soon recover. Looking at that note in my journal just now, I can still feel the grief coming off the page. I understand that he couldn't call me, as that would be admitting that Susan wouldn't recover. It breaks my heart to look at it. A few months later, the doorbell rang. It was Susan's daughter, Kathy. She was in New York and thought she would just drop by unannounced. I hadn't spoken to her in years. And I'm glad that she did stop by. She filled me in on Susan's last weeks. It seems that they were all in denial, thinking that she would recover. Susan was a force of nature. Susan did talk to Kathy about me, and how proud she was of me, that being my first angel helped me to be the success I was. Susan was and still is one of my angels, one of those guardian angels that looked after me when I was a fledgling, and whose presence I still feel around me from time to time. So this is my love letter to Susan. Thanks for listening. You can get the audiobook All Grown Up Now on iTunes, Audible, and Amazon, or from my website, allgrownupnow.com. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Play. If you have any questions, you can reach me through the website, allgrownupnow.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Kenneth D. King, on Facebook at Kenneth D. King Design, or on my main website, kennethdking.com.